questions about anything that we've talked about so far? They have popped up over lunch or that sort of thing. All right, well, we're going to talk, we're going to take a look at level flight performance. Now, from the FAA standpoint, the FAA is not in the business of requiring that an airplane fly so fast. That's left up to the customer. But the customer always wants to know how fast it goes. That's one of the first questions you seem to get asked. I had the opportunity to be involved when I worked at the beach. Had the opportunity to be involved in the first flight of the King Air 100. And after the first flight, Beach always had a big meeting down in what they call Mahogany Row, was where all the corporate offices were. And Mrs. Beach was in the meeting, and Frank Hedrick, who was her nephew, who was the president of the company, several other of the nephews who were vice presidents of the company, and the guy who was a test pilot, a fellow by the name of Bud Francis, and myself. I was the flight test engineer on the flight. And I'm in there, you know, expecting a lot of technical questions. Well, that wasn't what we got. I think the first question out of Mrs. Beach's mouth was, can I fly from here to New York? She liked to go to New York on shopping trips. Can I fly from here to New York nonstop? And then I think the next question was something like, how fast does it go? Well, those aren't things you do on the first flight. Okay, you know, you're looking at how the airplane handles, if there's any, you know, anything that kind of jumps out at you. And so I was, you know, I was sitting there, being the first time I'd been in one of these kinds of meetings, saying, wonder why that wasn't determined before we started building this airplane. But anyway, so as a young engineer, that was a kind of a wake-up call for me about what corporate management knew about what they were doing. So that was the case. So anyway, we're going to talk about level flight performance, i.e., how fast does it go? We're going to start answering that question with this lecture, and we'll finish it up a couple of weeks from now after next week's flight. We'll talk about how you do it. Today we're going to talk about the theory. Well, level flight performance, a measure of a condition where the forces and moments are in balance. And if we assume small angles of attack and of thrust, you know, we can say that lift is equal to weight and thrust is equal to drag. Now, I know that, you know, in the real case, everybody always puts the sines and cosines in there, you know, for the thrust and the drag and that sort of thing. And then they say, well, we'll make it a small angle assumption and throw the sines and cosines out. Well, I just threw them out to start with and say lift is equal to weight and thrust is equal to drag. So this is steady state condition. There is an acceleration here, okay? This is a 1G condition, and so we can make these assumptions. We're primarily concerned with the thrust and the drag. However, we're going to find that the lift and the weight also play a part. It's essentially a measurement of how drag varies with velocity. And we know that in some cases it varies as velocity squared. I used to, in my previous university job, we had a Cessna 310 that had a trailing cone. And told you this story, but whoever the student was in the back seat on the right side got to let the trailing cone out for the airspeed calibration where we use a trailing cone. They learned very quickly that drag is a function of velocity squared. Because I would slow the airplane down as slow as I, just could slow it in whole level flight. But if you sped up just a couple of knots, it got a lot harder to pull that trailing cone back in than it did to let it out. So a very good demonstration of the fact that drag varies as velocity squared. But in that equation, we said in level flight, thrust has to equal drag, and so we might call it a measure of the thrust required for a given velocity. And in subsonic flight, an airplane has two components of drag. One we'll call parasite drag, which includes zero lift drag and interference drag and any drag not associated with producing lift, okay? So that's my definition here of parasite drag. And we have induced drag, the drag created when you produce lift, the fact that really, when we produce lift, the vector's pointed aft, and that component, that aft component, is essentially the induced drag. So we'll take a look at these two and see what they mean. Well, the parasite drag, again, 1/2 air density, true airspeed squared, wing area, reference wing area, or parasite drag coefficient. And it's interesting to know we can change, if we change this to sea level density, we can make this calibrated airspeed, not true airspeed. And I'll guarantee you many of you sitting here in this class will forget that. Don't. See, in flight tests, we're simple-minded, okay? And we know that if we use sea level density in these equations and calibrated airspeed or equivalent airspeed for high-speed airplanes, that altitude doesn't make any difference on this guy. So you don't have to go in the table and look up air density or calculate it. So in flight tests, we generally will deal in either calibrated airspeed, which is, we do the calibration. We will deal in calibrated airspeed or equivalent airspeed for high-speed airplanes. Calibrated and equivalent are essentially equal at low speeds and reasonably low altitudes. You don't get much of a correction between calibrated and equivalent until you get 20,000 feet and above and 200 knots and above, okay? So where we're going to be flying, I'd love to see that Cherokee 6 go 200 knots, but it won't. Unless you're going straight down it might then. But, so we're gonna, we will change this to V sub C, and this will be rho sea level. So you only have to remember one number for density, 0.00237 slugs per foot cubed. It's burned into my brain from having used it so much, okay? I don't have to look that one up, that's memorized. But anyway, so this is the parasite drag. It's a function of velocity squared. So the faster you go, the higher it gets by S squared. Yes, sir?
Can you go back first?
Yeah, let's see. Go wrong direction. There we go.
That's CDP. Is that a?
Yeah, profile drag coefficient. Okay.
So that's the sum of
Yeah, that's the sum of all or the zero lift drag, you know, any interference drag, that sort of thing.
Do we get an estimate of it when they're designing the airplane? We get a ballpark?
They get a ballpark, but it is a ballpark. And the big thing that isn't, that's hard to estimate, interference drag. Interference drag gets to be a very large sum
That's
on a lot of airplanes.
And that's pylons and.
It's, yeah, anything that's hanging out, landing gear, fixed landing gear, well, for instance, on a Cherokee 6. When I worked at Piper, I knew there was a good deal of drag in the main gear with the, I call them the bird feet gear, like our Cherokee 6 has, looks like a chicken. What I didn't realize was how much. I thought in both main gear, I'd maybe get 5 knots by really cleaning it up. I got 10. Now 10 knots converts to, on that airplane, converts in range to about 25% additional range. That's a big number. But it took us 5 tries to get there. If you see a newer Cherokee 6 with wheel pans on, the wheel pans are actually bigger. But there's not any separation on them, none.
So it's just laminar flow.
It's pretty much laminar all the way around. And there's some secrets to it. One of the secrets is, a lot of the airplanes you'll see the wheel fairing is a teardrop, not a good shape. One dimension, it's okay. The second dimension, it separates from max thickness half. So, generally between the strut and the top of the fairing should be a 90-degree angle. And you keep that top part essentially flat. And that's what after 5 tries, that's what we finally ended up with. But what we would do is, we'd make the shape, put tufts on it, go out fly it, take pictures, see where the separation was, come back and fix that. And it took us 5 tries to get that fixed. But it was worth 10 knots on a Cherokee 6, just the 2 main landing gear. So 5 knots in each landing gear. That's a rather big number for interference drag, but that was what it was.
Somebody told me that the Sierra's, it's a fixed gear airplane. They looked into making it a retractable gear airplane, but it wouldn't go any faster because you'd have to increase the camber on the wing such that would increase the.
Probably so. The wing would have had to have gotten thicker.
Yeah, that's what I heard. So it's better, it's faster than a fixed gear airplane.
Yeah. Now you can even improve on it because they try to do the teardrop thing. You could improve on it. Do not try, anytime you get a kind of a double reverse curvature like that, it's going to separate. You just can't keep the flow attached. They could have kept it this way, but they needed to make the top of the fairing flat. Yeah. Well, for induced drag, it looks something like this. Notice that for true airspeed, we're still, as long as we're using true airspeed, we still got it squared there, but it's essentially 1 over the square of the velocity rather than just directly velocity squared. Well, here's what that looks like in a plot. Here's the profile of parasite drag. It's going up function of velocity squared. And this induced drag, as we increase, is coming down at 1 over the velocity squared. Notice that the minimum drag is where these 2 lines cross. And then we have a total drag curve, or we can call that a thrust required curve, okay? So, if we say thrust is equal to drag and level flight, then we can also say that's a thrust required curve, we just typed that. And several things about that. It's limited on the low speed end by stalling speed. Power on stalling speed in this case. Okay, so that's the limit on the slow speed side. The other thing, the velocity for minimum drag or thrust occurs where the parasite induced drags are equal. That's the velocity for L over D max. For a jet airplane, that would be maximum range because it would be minimum thrust required. And the curve is limited on the high speed end by the thrust available. Now, if you look at that same curve for a supersonic airplane, it's going to look something like this. Let's say this is Mach 1. Curve's going to come up, way up here. Once it's over the Mach, it's going to start coming down. And way out here, maybe say Mach, it's come way down. So what happened in the old days with jets, if this was the thrust available, this was as fast as you could go because you couldn't get over that hump. But one of the ways you could get up there is you get to climb up and dive, get supersonic, and then you could stay out here at a higher speed. So they call that the transonic drag rise or the transonic thrust pinch, whatever, and even today, even today's jet airplanes, jet fighters, if they have a thrust that's like that, thrust available, notice that out here, it still don't have a lot of acceleration. So what the military does generally is they look at Mach 0.8 to Mach 1.2, how long it takes in level flight to get between those 2 points because of this lack of thrust in excess. Generally, they'll do that in so many, you have to go between 0.8 and 1.2 in so many seconds or that sort of thing. What I've got here is a subsonic curve. For jets, L over D max is the velocity for best endurance and best glide. I think I said best range a while ago. That was an error. It's best endurance, minimum thrust required. That's where the minimum fuel flow occurs, okay? And best glide, if you're gonna wanna glide the farthest, that's where you go. For a propeller-driven airplane, L over D max is the velocity for best range. We're going to see why. Well, if we go back and look at those equations, 2 variables that can affect the thrust required, air density and lift. And if we look at the first equation, we find that the lift is equal to weight, so the aircraft weight becomes a real variable of interest. And a change in weight results in a change in the induced drag. and that makes the weight predominant at low airspeeds. It's worthy of note that speed for L over D max increases as weight increases. Shifts that curve to the right. Okay, here's a weight increase as a function of true airspeed and thrust. Weight going up, velocity tends to shift L over D max that way. Well, the change in the air density affects the parasite drag directly, and the induced drag is a function of 1 over the density. And that has the effect of shifting the thrust required curve to the right as altitude increases. Like this. The minimum thrust required remains the same, but the true airspeed increases. Okay, we plotted this versus true airspeed, and we see it. And that's why one of the reasons that jet airplanes like high altitude, propeller-driven airplanes like low altitude. Turbopropeller airplanes, turboprops, are best at some medium altitude. We'll talk more about that. So as you go up in altitude, this curve slides to the right. Unless you plot that curve as a function of equivalent or calibrated, then it stays the same. Here it's plotted as equivalent airspeed. Notice it doesn't slide to the right, but as the weight increases, it goes up. So weight affects the shape of the curve. Now, for propeller-driven airplanes, fuel flow is a function of power rather than thrust. And remember, power is thrust times velocity, okay? So now we have an additional velocity term in the equation. So for a propeller-driven airplane, that curve looks kind of the same, but it isn't exactly the same. Thrust times velocity, so here we are. Thrust horsepower is the thrust required times the true airspeed over 550 for a conversion factor. And the thrust horsepower required when we do that, we look at this, we could say this is the drag horsepower if we wanted to consider it that way, because this is profile drag or parasite drag coefficient. Again, we're plotting true airspeed, but notice that we have an additional airspeed term there. So it's airspeed cubed, not squared. However, this one, instead of being 1 over velocity squared, is just 1 over velocity. So the parasite power required varies as a function of velocity cubed, sometimes called the cube law for propeller-driven airplanes. And what happens is on a propeller-driven airplane, let's say you add 27 horsepower, which is easy to get. What's the cube root of 27? It's 3, right? That's how much speed you're going to increase you're going to get from adding 27 horsepower. So you can see right away on a propeller-driven airplane in a level flight, adding a lot of horsepower don't buy you much in speed, just due to that relationship. Now, we'll talk later about climb. It buys you a lot in climb because climb is just a function of thrust horsepower in excess.
They also say that the cleaner the airplane, the better you are.
Oh, absolutely. So you're going on a propeller-driven airplane, you're going to buy much more speed by reducing drag than you are by adding power. As far as flight speed goes. So that's where, you know, if it's a propeller-driven airplane, doesn't matter whether it's a King Air or a Cherokee 6, you're better off to try to reduce the drag, which was what I was working on the Cherokee 6 when I was a Piper. I figure there's probably about another 20 knots of drag in that airframe. So it could be a lot faster. That's what I'm saying that it is. Well, so here we are. Here we have, we're plotting thrust horsepower required. This is the thrust horsepower required curve. Again, here versus true airspeed. This curve now is a function of velocity cubed. This one is a function of 1 over velocity. So the induced power required in the case of a propeller-driven airplane isn't as great as is the profile power or parasite power required. Now, on this one, if you draw a line tangent to this curve,